I'm Daniel Morales, and this is episode 52 of the How to Japanese podcast. It's June 2024. We made it. Otsukare-sama desu. In the newsletter this month, which I just sent out, I wrote about Seichi Junrei, which is a 4-character word that represents a kind of interesting shift in language. If you break down the two compounds, Seichi literally means holy places, and Junrei is a word for pilgrimage. So if you were just reading this word in an article or something, you might think that it's a religious pilgrimage. One of the most famous religious pilgrimages in Japan is the 88 Temple pilgrimage in Shikoku. There are 88 temples all over the island, supposedly built by Kobo Daishi. I don't think all of them actually were, but people tour them. And I covered part of Shikoku in the summer of 2003 for a student travel guide. So I got to see a little bit of it firsthand. I probably only went to about maybe like 5 or 6 of the temples total, maybe a little bit more than that, 10 to 12. But people walk, they take bus tours, they cycle, and a lot of people just drive. And they'll even break it up into multiple trips because it's difficult to do in one go. But there are people who will do it for real and walk it. And these people are more generally referred to as henno. Henno is a word for pilgrim, the person doing the pilgrimage. And I don't think I heard the word Seichi Junrei once while I was there that summer. You often hear 88 kasho Junrei, something like that, referring to the actual 88 locations, but not Seichi. This word Seichi Junrei has, in the past 20 years, become almost exclusively associated with anime. One notable one is visiting the locations in the film Kimi no Nawa, Your Name. And in particular, there's a stairwell at Suga Shrine that was a location in the anime, and people will visit it. And going to see these locations in person is considered a Seichi Junrei. But this word has expanded beyond anime and is now, I think, a little bit more broadly being used to refer to visiting locations that are associated with someone who's particularly important to you for a fandom. And I actually did one myself recently. Back in April, I ended up having a Saturday free to myself, and I spent the morning watching NBA playoff basketball, and then I hopped on a train and headed over to Ashiya, which is a small town between Sannomiya and Nishinomiya. Sannomiya is the core part of downtown Kobe that you probably think of when you think about Kobe. And Ashiya is essentially a wealthy suburb of Kobe, of Sannomiya. And when I say the word suburb, I think Americans probably have a different kind of sense of suburb than Japan does. There's really no distinction between Kobe and Ashiya, or Ashiya and Sannomiya and Nishinomiya. It's all kind of this gradient that blends together, much in the same way that Tokyo blends into Yokohama, blends into Kawasaki, except on a slightly less intense scale here in Kansai. Ashiya, one thing that was always frequently said about Ashiya for a long time, I think, in Japan, was that if you go to Ashiya, be sure to collect the dust from your shoes because it's sure to be very valuable. That's probably not something you hear very much these days anymore. It's still a very wealthy suburb, but maybe not quite the same level of wealth as during the bubble. It's also well known as Murakami's hometown, which is the reason why I visited it. He used it as the setting for his first 3 novels, Hear the Wind Sing, Pinball 1973, and A Wild Sheep Chase. And I found a really detailed blog post in Japanese about different sites to visit in Ashiya that included everywhere from a patissier that he went on dates to the port he wrote about in his novels, and then the schools he attended when he was a young student. I'll put that link in the newsletter and in the blog post this month, so definitely worth checking out if this is something you're interested in doing yourself sometime. I kind of hamstrung myself by starting so late in the day So I didn't get to do everything. There's still a couple of interesting sites that I think I'd like to get to. But I did have a really good time, and I walked enough to kind of wear myself out that I didn't. That's another reason I didn't have time to get to everything. I was just kind of done for the day. The first place I stopped was Henri Charpentier. I'm sure I'm butchering that last name, but this is a pâtissier that's been around in Asia since 1969 and is famous for crêpes Suzette. It's actually named after the person who invented crêpes Suzette, and it's a fancy little cafe on the corner of a tree-lined street about 10 minutes from the station. It sells little pastries that are beautiful little pastries to go, but you can also sit and have crêpes Suzette, which is what I did. Um, and thinking about where it is on this kind of tree-lined avenue reminds me of all the kind of foliage that was in Asia. The trees and the space there are really what I think distinguishes it from other similar places in Japan. To be honest, there's not much that differentiates it from another urban suburb in Japan. Other than that, it's kind of more pristine, if I had to choose a word. It's spacious and green and has uh, a good number of cafes and boutiques along several kind of like wider avenues that have a lot of trees on them. I my impression of Asia is that it's more noticeable for what isn't there. There are no pachinko parlors. There's very few small commercial or industrial buildings outside of the port area. In these smaller neighborhoods, there aren't many of these small factories that you see in Osaka and Tokyo, or small industrial buildings. It's almost purely residential and then high-end commercial, like boutiques and salons and things like that, pâtissiers. So after going to Henri Charpentier, I made a quick detour to the Tanizaki Memorial Museum of Literature. Tanizaki also lived in Asia when he moved to Kanto, from Kanto to Kansai after the 1923 earthquake. And from what I could understand, it also kind of marked the end of his first marriage. The museum itself is just a tiny little kind of two-room building with a small garden outside, but the exhibits that I was able to see were really well done. They had a lot of photography, and the garden is a beautiful little space. I would say if you're a Tanizaki fan, it's definitely a must visit. It gives you a really good sense of kind of the area where he would have lived, which at the time probably would have been right along the water, until they filled in the port a little bit. If you're not a Tanizaki fan, I'd say you can skip the museum. And if you're not a Murakami fan, I think you can probably skip Asia altogether, to be honest. If you're not a Murakami maniac like myself, I'm not sure why you would go there. But if you are a Murakami fan, it's definitely worth a trip. The highlight was walking from the Tanizaki Museum through the neighborhoods where Murakami grew up, underneath the Hanshin Expressway to the small park called Uchide Park. This is a park that was recently renovated, and it really makes me regret not going sooner. Sooner, as in a year or two ago. If I had gone immediately upon moving to Osaka, I probably would have been able to see the park kind of more along the lines of as it was when Murakami was there, and what he was referring to when he was writing about it in Hear the Wind Sing. The park was recently renovated, and it had been kind of like, I want to say languishing. Obviously I didn't see it, but my sense is that it had been languishing for a long time. Murakami calls it the park with a monkey cage in his first book, Hear the Wind Sing, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a small kind of bare bones Japanese urban park. Dirt covered ground, no grass, maybe a few pieces of children's equipment, a bench or two, and then this one happened to have a monkey cage. Ashia was the kind of neighborhood, the kind of town that could support a monkey cage, which I think is pretty emblematic for the kind of place Ashia is, the kind of time in history that Asia went through from 1959, when they first started keeping monkeys, birds, and squirrels, to the last monkey dying in 2003, and then animals no longer being kept in the cage in 2010. So this is Japan's economic boom. This is a kind of affluence that is able to have a little like piece of trivia kind of thing for the kids to go see at the park without having to go all the way to the zoo somewhere. I imagine the zoo would be a little bit farther, but that's the kind of time and place that this was, that Murakami was writing about. Yeah, pretty interesting. And I'm sad that I didn't get to visit it in that sense. There are photos that you can see online of the cage, and by all accounts, it's probably good that the cage is gone. It was really small, probably did not provide great quality of life to the monkeys, and kind of leaving it around and keeping it as a memorial would be, what would it be memorializing? The park itself, Murakami's first novel. I'm not sure if that would be worth it. I was kind of sick that I missed it. It would have been very cool to see that little piece of history, that connection with a very different era of Japan from the current day. And in general, I'm in favor of preservation, especially in Japan, where things kind of get bulldozed pretty quickly so the next project can start. But I think the goal of the preservation movement isn't to preserve everything. Choices need to be made so that when you do move to preserve something, it matters, I think, and I can recognize that. The park is also much nicer now. It's got a Japanese garden there. There's a lot nicer equipment. There's a small community center right next door connected with the town library, and you can go up onto the second floor and just kind of sit and look out over the garden that's now part of the park, and you don't have to pay any money to do so, which is kind of nice. The monkey cage itself has been reused as part of the sign for the park, and it has a plaque detailing some of its history, including the Murakami aspect, that connection. Another part of the cage seems to be used in the community center as a kind of like signboard, although I'm not sure if it's kind of distinguished with anything recognizing that. It looks very similar to the piece of the cage that's a sign in the park itself. So yeah, it was cool to visit. It was nice to kind of get out, walk around the neighborhoods, kind of get a sense of what it might have been like growing up as Murakami, what his experience might have been like. But my biggest takeaway was seeing the full spectrum of Asia, which I think I experienced walking from the museum underneath the expressway through the Uchide Shotengai, the covered shopping arcade, and then to the park. The Shotengai, the covered shopping arcade, like the neighborhood itself, is just pristine. There are a couple modern restaurants and bars, but there are also some older, really well-maintained Japanese cafes that seem like very much, Showa era almost, and a greengrocer that is still operating. When you after you cut through the arcade, there are more tree-lined streets, more boutiques in the largely residential neighborhood, and kind of up off in the distance, because I say up because the whole town slopes up from the port to Mount Rokko, which is kind of north of Osaka Bay, and you can see these wealthy neighborhoods terraced on the side of the mountain. And these, I think, are the wealthy neighborhoods that people think about when they think about Asia. It's not the neighborhood where Murakami grew up, which gets lumped in with those wealthy neighborhoods. It's these mansions on the top of the hill that are kind of like looking down on the bay. And for me, I think that represented the tension in Murakami's early works. His narrator, like Murakami, is clearly relatively well off, middle to upper class economically and socially, but he's living south of the expressway at the foot of the hill. And then on top of this hill are the rich, and according to Rat, his sidekick, the rich can all eat shit, even though the Rat is one of these members of the rich. So that tension of being in this place, yet separate, of having enough but not quite, like the plenty that is on the top of the hill, almost in a Gatsby-esque kind of way, was really interesting to think about and see in person. And so I was glad I made the trip. I wouldn't have gone if I was not a fan of Murakami, if he was not my oshi, as you might say, another word that is sort of starting to mutate, like Seichi Junrei, I think. So oshi is, I believe the origin, it comes from boy and girl bands, where you will pick an oshi from the group. You pick your favorite, and that would be your oshi, the person you're literally pushing or recommending. The word osu is used to mean push, but you can also spell oshi with the same word for recommend, the same Japanese character, the same kanji for recommend. And it's come to mean something more broadly, just that something that you're a fan of, something that you want to promote. And then the word oshikatsu is taking katsu from katsudo, activities, putting it on oshi. Oshikatsu is something you do to kind of be part of the fandom. And I think the funniest thing that I saw in the last couple of months was the fact that there are bags of potato chips that are saying, here, you can do oshikatsu by buying this bag of potato chips. And on the top corner, there's a little slogan that says, okashi na oshikatsu. So okashi being the word for snack, sweet, okashi na oshikatsu. So oshikatsu for snacks. And this is a bag of potato chips, clearly trying to kind of tap into this trendy term that has gone from niche to more mainstream. And so I think it's probably okay for me to call Murakami my oshi. He's not a prototypical oshi, but I did some searching on Twitter, and I found some tweets suggesting that it's not impossible. I included one in the newsletter, and the author basically says, I'm a fan of many different celebrities, but I'm not certain how I'd answer if somebody asked me who is my oshi. If it came down to it, I'd answer Murakami right now. And then he goes on to say, Murakami Haruki ga oshi toyu no wa chiguhagu na kanji ga suru. So it feels a little inconsistent, strange to call Murakami an oshi. Murakami Haruki ga oshi toyu no wa chiguhagu na kanji ga suru. So maybe Murakami's a bit too mainstream. It's clearly not something niche. It's clearly not that initial category of like girl or boy band. But at any rate, he's my oshi, And in the newsletter, I kind of make the argument or start to think that having an oshi is fundamentally good for studying the language. Oshikatsu, these activities for your fandom, create momentum and movement that will put you in a position to interact with Japanese out in the wild, reading it, speaking it, hearing it. And if you didn't have it, you might end up just kind of sitting around all day. So I think it's good to have an interest. You don't have to be obsessive about it. You don't have to kind of do what I do with Murakami, but you can let the fandom, you can let that interest kind of guide you and even make decisions for you when you're kind of bumping into decision fatigue. If you've got a free day, you're not sure how to spend it, let me find something I can do related to my oshi out in the world, rather than sitting inside all day playing the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, which is how I'll be spending the rest of my day. So yeah, I'm curious to know if any readers or listeners have an oshi of their own, maybe one that's a little bit unusual like my own, of Murakami, or if there's someone else that's maybe more prototypical, definitely let me know in the comments. Let me know what kind of oshikatsu you're doing. Have they been particularly helpful for your Japanese language study? I'd be really curious to know. And if you are going to be playing Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC, tag me on Twitter. Let me know. I think there is a way to do co-op with specific people rather than just random people you summon. So that I've never done, but it would be fun to try that. And that's the main newsletter and blog post for this month. In the Ito Ito section, I shared a couple of really interesting links. The Twitter account Mulboyne, at Mulboyne, Mulboyne, is a really interesting account that's always tweeting these long threads of Japanese history, often related to kind of obscure pop culture, but also just kind of current events. And so there's always something interesting there. I don't know who it is. I think it's an anonymous author, but always a lot of really interesting content. And one of the links they shared was an article in Diamond, which I believe may be a magazine or something, but it's online, this article. And the article is it's in Japanese, and it's looking at whether or not omotenashi is actually a Japanese concept. And the author kind of says maybe it's a marketing promise that was made to domestic tourists during the economic decline that kind of got a little bit out of hand and got associated with Japanese culture and as a fundamental aspect of Japanese culture, and is now encouraging bad behavior by foreign tourists. I can kind of see where the writer's coming from. Mulboyne breaks it down on Twitter in English, but it's a really good article to read in Japanese. So I highly recommend going and reading it yourself. It's about five. You have to click through 5 separate pages to kind of get through the whole thing, but it's worth it. I highly recommend it. And if you are a university student, it could even make a really interesting research topic, or even just something for a presentation if you need something to write about. If your teacher makes you find articles or something that are a little bit more substantial, it feels like hefty enough to be something you could dig your teeth into in terms of research, argumentation, writing, discussion, debate, while at the same time being accessible enough for intermediate students and people who are kind of getting to that advanced student area, that level of Japanese. I would say perfect for that level. The other link that I send out in the Ito Ito section of the newsletter is there is a Twitter account that's at JPY that tracks the exchange rate of the yen, and it's back online. It went offline at some point. I think because there were changes in the way automated accounts could work. There were some kind of restrictions that were placed upon those kinds of accounts not too long after he who will not be named took over Twitter, and a lot of those accounts went offline. But it's a great account. It's just all it does is tweet out the exchange rates a couple times every hour, and there must have been some kind of easing on those restrictions because it's back in business, and it's a really good way to keep up with the exchange rate, which is really depressing these days. Unfortunately, at the time of recording, it's 159 yen to the US dollar. So with no like long-term change in sight, unfortunately. So we'll see. And that's all I have for you this month. A little bit shorter of a podcast, but yeah, definitely do go check out the newsletter, the blog post. Hope you all are keeping cool. It's finally starting to get hot in Japan. We're just about in the rainy season here in Osaka, and I am not going to be limiting my ice cream intake for the next couple of months, and I recommend that you do the same wherever you happen to be. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in July.